My name is Cassidy Marrow, and I was 34 years old the evening my aorta split open in the corridor of the very hospital where I had spent 11 years keeping other people alive. While a cardiothoracic surgeon I recognized by his laugh made the first incision into my chest, the front desk followed protocol and dialed my emergency contact, a number buried in an old patient file, 7 years stale. My sister answered from a brunch table. She listened to the words emergency open heart surgery, and then she said, calm as a woman canceling a subscription, "She's not our problem anymore." She hung up, ordered another mimosa, and posted a family selfie 40 minutes later. Caption, living our best life. My father, when the hospital tried his number next, watched the screen light up, pressed decline, and slid his phone back into his shirt pocket. For 3 weeks, I believed the silence was the whole story. Then my aunt walked through my recovery room, door carrying a thin envelope that had been waiting 8 years for the right emergency. And I learned something that changed the entire architecture of my past. My family hadn't simply abandoned me on an operating table. They had been billing me since before I was old enough to understand what a ledger was. What I did with that envelope, and with the $38,000 check my mother eventually slid across her white tablecloth like a closing offer, none of them saw coming. Not even close. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the people who were supposed to be your harbor turn out to be the storm you survived. If you have ever been made to feel like a liability inside your own bloodline, stay with me. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and make sure you're subscribed, because you are going to want to know what was inside that envelope. It happened on a Tuesday in March, at 6:47 in the evening, 11 hours and 47 minutes into my shift in the cardiac ICU. I remember the exact time because I was logging it for a patient when the pain chose me instead. It began behind my sternum, not the dull pressure of a typical cardiac event, but something architectural, something structural, tearing upward through my jaw like a seam giving way under too much tension. I had described that sensation to nursing students more times than I could count. Hearing my own clinical description echo back at me from inside my own chest is a particular kind of irony that defies adequate language. I set down the tablet. I took my own pulse. Fast, wrong. 11 years on that unit, and my very first instinct was still professional. This presentation is not a myocardial infarction. This is an aortic dissection. This is worse. My auteurs, our charge nurse, my closest friend across a decade of 12-hour shifts, caught me before I reached the floor. I heard her call it overhead. I heard the word dissection move through the unit like a current. I heard the ward I had poured my adult life into redirect every piece of its machinery toward me. They cut my scrub top with the shears I kept in my own pocket. Someone's palms pressed my sternum. The ceiling tiles I had stared past for 11 years scrolled overhead, like highway markers at speed. An aortic dissection kills half its victims before they ever reach an operating table. I knew that number. I had cited that number to worried families. The last thing I registered before the anesthesia closed over me was my own monitor, that high, insistent alarm I had answered for other human beings my entire career, alarming now for me. And the last coherent thought I formed was not a prayer, not a face, not a memory. It was a single unfinished question someone should call. I could not complete it. Here is something most people never learn until they need to. When you arrive unconscious on a gurney, no one waits for your family's permission to operate. 2 attending physicians signed the emergency consent while the OR team scrubbed in. My family could not have stopped that surgery, and as it turned out, they never got the opportunity to try. But hospitals are required to notify next of kin. It is policy, it is decency, and it is a data field. And that data field is where my past reassembled itself without my knowledge. 3 years before this night, I had performed what I privately called a surgical removal of my family from my life. New emergency contacts in my phone, new beneficiary designations on every financial account. I had even written a will, something my attorney described as unusual for a healthy 31-year-old. I thought I had located every door they could walk back through and locked it with precision. What I missed was a patient file from 7 years earlier, the night I'd had my appendix out at my own hospital, back when I was 27 and still attended Christmas. That admission listed my mother, Carol Marrow, as next of kin. When I rolled in unconscious, the intake system reached for its most recent family contact the way SIS. TEMS always do, automatically, without judgment, without context. Nobody did anything wrong. The nurse who made that call followed the same protocol I had followed hundreds of times myself. That is the part that still unsettles me most. There was no villain in the first hour, just a database doing exactly what it was built to do. Maya told me everything, exactly once, months later at my kitchen table, because I asked her to and because she does not lie to me. The phone rang 4 times. A young woman answered with music behind her and the cheerful percussion of glassware and laughter. Maya asked for Carol Marrow. "This is her daughter," the voice said. "Who's this?" Maya identified herself, delivered the words no family should have to receive, emergency surgery, cardiac, critical, and asked how quickly someone could come. There was a pause, Maya said. 3 seconds maybe, long enough that she thought the connection had dropped. Then my sister Delaney, 30 years old, mother of 2, said, "She's not our problem anymore." And she ended the call. Maya tried again immediately. Voicemail. Declined, not missed. The call had been actively rejected. She tried my father's number next. It rang twice and died mid-third ring, which is precisely what a phone does when someone examines the screen and makes a deliberate choice. My father, the man who taught me to check my oil and wept openly at his own mother's funeral, looked at a hospital's incoming call while his daughter was on cardiopulmonary bypass, and put his phone back in his pocket. Maya wrote family notified in the record, because technically it was true. Then she went into the supply room and, by her own account, rearranged it violently for 10 minutes. Nobody from my family called back that night, or the next day, or the week after that. I woke on day 2 with an endotracheal tube in my throat and a stranger's handwriting on the whiteboard across from my bed. My first coherent emotion was embarrassment. Nurses make objectively terrible patients. By day 3, I was extubated and attempting to read my own cardiac monitor upside down. By day 4, my colleagues had threatened to tape a towel over the screen. The humor in that lasted about 48 hours before it didn't. On day 5, when I finally asked Maya out loud, "Did anyone call back?" she looked at the ceiling and said something vague about old numbers and misunderstandings. She is a magnificent nurse and a genuinely poor liar. I had watched her deliver unbearable truths to families for a decade. I knew every micro-expression her face made when the truth was undeliverable. I didn't push. Some part of me had already completed the arithmetic. The photograph found me on discharge day. Maya went still while scrolling her phone beside me as I signed paperwork, the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to protect you. I reached over and turned the screen toward myself before she could decide. There they were, my mother, my father, Delaney and her husband. 4 mimosas lifted toward a window camera, my mother's lipstick immaculate, my father mid-laugh, a laugh I hadn't heard in 3 years. The caption, "Living our best life." The timestamp placed it 90 minutes after Maya's call. 90 minutes after she's not our problem anymore. 90 minutes after my father pressed decline. While a machine breathed on my behalf, they ordered another round and documented their contentment for 43 likes. I want to tell you I felt rage. What I actually felt was quieter and colder than that, like a door I had been holding open for 3 years finally clicking shut under its own weight. I put the phone face down. I finished signing my discharge papers. What I took home instead of fury was arithmetic. 8 weeks of no income, a tuition installment on my nurse practitioner program due in 6 weeks, and the clinic fund. The small account where a hand-drawn floor plan with flower boxes was supposed to someday become real, sitting at a number so far from sufficient that I laughed out loud, alone, in my apartment. To explain how I reached this point, I have to take you back to a yellow kitchen in coastal Maine that smelled of percolated coffee and dish soap. The house where my grandmother, Margaret, raised my father, and eventually needed someone to help her remain in it. I was 22, fresh out of nursing school, living 40 minutes away. My parents lived 12 minutes from her front door. My mother had opinions about who should manage things, and she delivered them the way she delivered everything, with her hand on your shoulder and warmth in her voice that functioned like a legal document. Family takes care of family, Cassidy. So for 5 years, from 22 to 27, I drove to that yellow kitchen after shifts and on my days off. I managed Margaret's medications, prepared her low-sodium meals that she pretended to find insulting, and fought her insurance company on speakerphone while she made faces at me acros. The table. My mother supervised from a comfortable distance. My sister was still finding herself, which apparently required brunch on a rotating basis. I need to be honest with you, I am not sorry I did it. Margaret was the finest company of my life. She was the only person in that family who ever looked at me and asked, "Who's taking care of you, honeybee?" On the back of one of her prescription printouts, we once sketched a floor plan together, a small cardiac rehabilitation clinic for people in the county, the kind of facility that might have saved her a decade of preventable decline. She drew flower boxes on the windows. I still have that piece of paper. A few weeks before she died, she took my hand and said something I dismissed as the medication. "I set something aside for you, honeybee. If it ever goes missing, ask Ruth." 3 years before my surgery, two things happened within the same month, and my family's narrative machinery transformed them into a single verdict. First, my father needed a knee replacement. My mother announced, not asked, that I would be leaving my nurse practitioner program for a semester to move home and manage his recovery. It's one semester. Family takes care of family. I said no, but I want to be precise about what that refusal actually looked like, because it matters enormously. I built my father a recovery plan the way I would for any patient I genuinely cared about. I hired a home health aide from my own income for the first month. I printed his physical therapy schedule and affixed it inside the kitchen cabinet. I drove out on my day off to configure his medication organizer. What I would not do was dismantle the career I had constructed alone. With $61,000 in student loans, I was still actively repaying. To become an unpaid live-in nurse for a man with a working wife and a healthy adult daughter 12 minutes away. Second, my sister asked me to cosign the mortgage on a 4-bedroom house she could not afford. I declined that too, gently, with apologies I did not actually owe. My mother's verdict came at Sunday dinner, in front of my aunt and 2 cousins, delivered like a judicial ruling. Selfish. That was the entirety of the trial. Within a year, I was removed from the Christmas card photograph, the family group chat, and the wedding invitations of cousins I had babysat through their childhoods. The twist I did not fully appreciate until much later. I was the one who was cut off, but everyone in town heard that I had left. Weeks 3 through 5, I learned to be carried. I was catastrophically bad at it. Recovery from open-heart surgery is a full-time occupation with a genuinely sadistic supervisor. You walk the hospital corridor clutching a pillow against your sternum so your own ribcage doesn't protest with each step. You sleep sitting upright because lying flat feels like drowning. You cry at supermarket commercials because your body has decided that all emotional material now lives inside your incision. The sternum is, it turns out, the body's emotional switchboard. But my apartment ran like a small, warm conspiracy. Maya had produced a schedule, an actual laminated document affixed to my refrigerator, and the day shift had signed up in ink. Soup on Mondays from Priya. Rides to cardiology on Thursdays from Big Tom, who drove with the gravitas of a man transporting organs. 14 names by the end of week 4, and not one of them was Marrow, except the 68-year-old with the Buick, who had claimed every Sunday and defended it territorially. I kept trying to repay them. I ordered pizza to the unit. I started a thank you spreadsheet. I attempted to reimburse Priya for groceries until she threatened to bill me for emotional distress. Maya eventually sat me down on my own couch and said, "You don't owe us. That is the entire point of us." I heard it. I didn't believe it yet. 34 years of training does not exit with the chest tubes. But I heard it, and something shifted an inch on its foundation. A get well card arrived from my mother that first week home. Cream-colored envelope, a watercolor lighthouse on the front, a store-brand sentiment wishing me smooth sailing. It was signed the Marrows, not Mom, not Love, the way you'd sign a return address label, a corporate filing. Beneath the printed text, in my mother's own script, the actual reason for the card's existence: "Hope you're mending. Katie's baptism is next month at St. John's. The whole family will be there. We'd appreciate you not making things awkward. No need for everyone to hear the details of your situation. It's a happy day. Your situation. My aorta tearing itself open was a situation, a detail, a logistical inconvenience to be managed before it leaked into the pews and complicated the official story of H. Heartland, Maine. The one where I'm the selfish daughter who abandoned a loving family. She wasn't checking on me. She was performing crisis containment. The postscript, small and almost cheerful at the bottom. P.S. Your sister was only joking. You know how she is. They had discussed it. At some kitchen table, within days of my surgery, my family had convened a story conference. They had reviewed the phone call. They had weighed it. And the version they approved required no hospital visits and filed my sister's response under humor. I set the card down the way you set down an instrument you are genuinely tempted to throw. The first Saturday after discharge, someone knocked on my apartment door. It was not my mother. My Aunt Ruth stood in the doorway holding a casserole dish like a shield. Ruth is my father's older sister, 68 years old, retired postmaster of the county, a woman who spent 4 decades sorting other people's correspondence and a lifetime keeping her own family's letters unread. She does not hug so much as briefly install you against her shoulder. She walked in, set the casserole on the stove, and went to work. She discarded the expired food. She watered the plant Maya's rotation had missed. She studied my new medication list through her reading glasses with the focused attention of a woman verifying correct postage. What she did not do, ask why I hadn't called my mother, offer apologies on anyone's behalf, audition excuses. 3 years of exile had trained me to expect every Emerson conversation to arrive with a collections notice stapled to it. Ruth just handed me a fork and told me the casserole needed salt, and she'd made it anyway because salt was apparently trying to kill me now. I nearly wept over that fork. Twice that afternoon, I watched her hand drift toward her coat pocket where something stiff and paper-colored peeked from the edge. An envelope, soft at the corners, carried a long time. Twice she touched it. Twice she withdrew. When she left, she stood in my doorway a moment too long and said quietly, mostly to herself, "Not yet." She came back Wednesday with soup. That was the day she told me what my father had said. Ruth had been at my parents' house the afternoon of my surgery, dropping off seed catalogs. She was standing in the kitchen when my sister's call came through. Delaney had phoned my mother from the restaurant, laughing the way you'd report a minor inconvenience. Some nurse says Cassidy's having heart surgery. I told her she's not our problem anymore. My mother wiped the counter twice and said the hospital was probably being dramatic. They always are. And my father, Frank Marrow, sat at the kitchen table he has occupied for 40 years, looked at his coffee cup and asked one question. Not is she alive? Not which hospital? He asked, is it going to cost us anything? Ruth told me this with her hands folded, watching me absorb it the way she'd watched me absorb a diagnosis. And I'll tell you what I told her. There's a species of hurt that bypasses grief entirely and goes straight to arithmetic. My sister's response was cruelty, loud, stupid, survivable. My father's question was a ledger entry. Somewhere inside that man's chest, his daughter on an operating table had been filed under expenses. Weeks later, Ruth gave me the envelope. She came in the morning and placed it on my kitchen table. Neither of us reached for it immediately. It was an ordinary envelope made soft by years of being carried, the flap tucked, not sealed, and on the front, in handwriting I hadn't seen since the funeral, in that upright, deliberate schoolteacher's script, just my name, Cassidy. She gave it to me the winter before she passed, Ruth said, told me to hold it until the girl needs it. Not wants it, needs it. Ruth sat with her purse on her lap like a woman at a bus stop. A torn aorta qualifies. I'm sorry I waited 3 weeks. I wanted you strong first. Inside the envelope, 2 items. The first was a letter from Margaret. Several pages, folded in thirds, her precise handwriting moving across them in careful lines. The second was a single older sheet, creased into quarters, in different handwriting entirely. Handwriting I recognized the way you recognize a voice in the dark, from birthday cards, from permission slips, from the note left in my first car, check your oil. Love, Dad. This sheet had a date at the top, 12 years old. It read, borrowed from mother's fund set aside for Cassidy's schooling $38,000 will repay in full, signed in blue ink. FM. I read it twice. The room went quiet the way rooms do when furniture you have sat on your entire life turns out to be evidence. Ruth said, gently, "You were never not their problem, child. You were their credit line." My hands have steadied dying hearts inside open chest cavities. They shook now. I read Margaret's letter aloud, because Ruth said she would have wanted a voice on it, and mine was the one available. "My honeybee," it began. "If Ruth has given you this, something has gone wrong, and I am sorry I'm not there to make coffee while you're angry about it." Then she told the story plainly, the way she did everything. In 2010, Margaret had set aside $38,000. Her teacher's pension savings combined with the proceeds from selling her sister's lakefront lot, earmarked specifically for my nursing education. So I could, as she wrote, start your life without a stone on your back. She had trusted my father to manage the funds because he was her son, and because trusting was easier than fighting my mother. By 2013, the money was gone. She discovered it through a bank statement. When she confronted them, my mother, Margaret, quoted her directly, didn't flinch. "Cassidy doesn't need it. She got loans, Delaney's wedding can't wait, and Frank needs a reliable truck." A wedding I attended and danced at, $22,000. A pickup truck my father still drives, $16,000. Margaret had been too ill by then to pursue legal remedies. What she had the strength to do was sit her son down, make him write out exactly what he had taken, and sign it. Then she mailed her conscience to Ruth for safekeeping. The final page of the letter was addressed to me alone. "Love that keeps a ledger isn't love. Honeybee, don't you ever sign one." I sat with that sentence, while my coffee cooled completely. 9 years I spent paying off $61,000 in student loans. 9 years of night differentials, skipped vacations, deferred everything. While the money meant to spare me all of it, purchased a reception hall and a pickup truck. 3 years ago, they didn't cut me off for refusing to give. They cut me off because looking at me meant seeing the invoice. Week 8, they cleared me for part-time work. Not the ICU yet, my sternum and my cardiologist holding a united position on that. So they placed me in cardiac rehabilitation, the sunlit gym on the first floor where survivors relearn what their bodies are capable of, 3 mornings a week. I had always thought of rehab as the gentle wing. It is not. It is the honest wing. Everything that broke you is still in the room, you just walk on a treadmill alongside it. My second Tuesday there, I met a woman in her 70s, post-bypass, immaculate cardigan, who spent her entire session watching the parking lot. Her daughter drove her every visit and never came inside, sitting in a gray sedan for the full hour, engine off. The intake notes said estranged with the neutrality of a weather report. When the session ended, the woman asked if I'd walk her out. 20 feet from the car, the daughter looked up, and I watched 2 people look at each other through what appeared to be 20 years of glass. I went home and couldn't sleep, not because of my heart, but because I recognized both seats of that car. That week I found Margaret's floor plan in my desk drawer, the one with the flower boxes, and I stopped treating the clinic as a someday. The hospital foundation runs a community development grant, $50,000, one award annually. I wrote the application in 6 nights. The Margaret Center, outpatient cardiac rehabilitation for rural communities. Her name in the title, exactly where my mother would eventually have to read it. I mailed it on a Tuesday. On Thursday, my father's heart finally did what hearts do when you have been feeding them silence and stubbornness and untreated stress for 63 years. He collapsed at the farm supply store between the fence wire and the birdseed. The county ambulance brought him to my hospital, the only cardiac program for 40 miles, where the catheterization team threaded a stent into him inside an hour. Frank Marrow, 63, got parked 2 floors below the unit where his daughter had nearly died in March, and was prescribed the standard gospel: medications, a low-sodium diet, and 12 weeks of outpatient cardiac rehabilitation. Which is how I learned, reading the intake board on my Wednesday shift, that my father had been referred to the gym where I now worked. I stood there holding my coffee, appreciating whatever cosmic architect had arranged this particular irony. Then the elevator opened, and for the first time in 3 years, my mother walked toward me down a corridor I was being paid to occupy. Carol Marrow, 61, pressed cardigan, purse held in both hands like a hymnal. I watched her assemble her expression as she approached. I know that assembly intimately. I grew up beneath it, watched it being deployed in 100 kitchen negotiations. What she landed on was warmth, not approximated warmth. Genuine, blue ribbon, bake sale warmth. "There you are," she said, as though I had simply been mislaid, as though the preceding 3 years were weather that had inconvenienced us both equally and was now resolved. No mention of March, no glance at the scar edging above my collar. She took both my hands in hers and she smiled, the smile that had run 1,000 fundraisers, and said, "Family takes care of family, Cassidy. It's time you came home." Hold on, because the same people who decided I wasn't their problem were about to hand me theirs, gift-wrapped, with terms attached. She was not there to apologize, she was there to collect. She bought me coffee in the hospital cafeteria. I mention this because she would mention it, and laid out the proposal with the serene efficiency of a woman reading a grocery list she had already shopped. I would give up my apartment in Bangor and move back into my childhood room. I would drive my father to his appointments, manage his medications, prepare the cardiac diet, monitor his blood pressure. Duration, until your father is himself again, a unit of time the Marrow calendar has never printed an end date on. Salary, none, belonging was the wage. I asked the obvious question. My sister lived 12 minutes away, I lived 40. Her response was immediate and smooth. Your sister has the children, and Scott's in his busy season. Insurance has a busy season now, apparently. I did not argue. I did something considerably more dangerous to her plan, my job. I pulled a notepad from my pocket and built my father an actual care structure, the one I would build for any patient with his chart. A home health nurse 3 mornings per week. His rehab schedule at my own facility where I could personally track his numbers. A pharmacist consultation, a registered dietitian, the full continuum. Better care than I could provide, exhausted and resentful in a twin bed 40 minutes from my own life. I costed everything on a napkin and offered to coordinate every piece of it. My mother looked at my napkin the way you'd look at a stranger's dog that has appeared on your porch uninvited, and pushed it back across the table with one finger. We don't bring in strangers. And I understood, with a clarity that was almost restful, that she didn't want better care for him. She wanted me back in position. The town began arriving in casserole dishes within days. A chicken dish appeared in the hospital break room with my name on a sticky note and a card from the women's circle. A cousin I hadn't heard from in 3 years, not during my surgery, not once texted, "You're literally a nurse. It's nothing for you." My Sunday school teacher called my personal phone to report my mother had wept at the pharmacy counter. I want you to see the machine clearly, because it took me 3 decades to read the schematics. My mother never needs to win a confrontation directly. She tells the story once, at the right altitude, and the community repeats it until it calcifies into weather. She is the narrator, and the narrator decides who is selfish. Each casserole was a subpoena. That night, I built the weapon. I am not going to pretend otherwise. I photographed my father's handwritten note under the kitchen light, cropped it clean, and drafted a message to the extended family group chat I hadn't been welcome in for 3 years, 41 people, the same audience that had received the brunch selfie. I wrote it cold and factual. Dates, figures, no editorial adjectives. My thumb hovered over send for a long time. I understood exactly what that button was. For 3 years, my mother had owned the story of who I was in that community. One tap and I would own it instead. Every woman at the church would know what the Marrow family's financial problems actually looked like. It would have felt like oxygen. And then, sitting there at 2 in the morning in my quiet kitchen, something honest surfaced. My own voice, not Margaret's. Their whole power is the story. If I seize the story, I just become the new Carol. Same courtroom, different judge. The other option, a lawyer, a 12-year-old handwritten note between a woman now deceased and her son, had its own dead end. And anyway, court wasn't what I needed. What I needed, and I say this as someone who spent 5 years learning it the hard way, was to stop holding receipts at all. I deleted the message. I put the note and the letter in my nightstand drawer, not as a weapon, as a compass. Ruth was at the door when she stopped and said one more thing. Your father's been having chest pains for a year. Won't see anyone about it. Carol says prayer will manage it. I stood there, a cardiac nurse, with a drawer full of the truth, listening to that sentence tick. One afternoon, I drove to Ruth's house and asked the question I had been avoiding. What was my mother like before I existed? Ruth rocked for a long while before she answered. Carol Hutchins, she used the maiden name I'd almost never heard, was 19 when her mother was diagnosed with cancer. 2 older brothers, both gone. So Carol dropped her secretarial course and spent 2 years feeding her mother, bathing her mother, turning her through the nights so the pressure sores wouldn't start. Alone every single day. I'd see her at the market, Ruth said, gray as dishwater at 21. At the funeral, both brothers arrived in press suits, divided the land, and one clapped Carol on the shoulder and said their mother was lucky to have her. Then they drove away, and she received nothing. Not from the estate, not from the family, not from a single purr. Son who thought to ask what 2 years had cost her. Ruth set her tea down on the porch rail. I'm not excusing your mother, child. I watched what she did to you across 30 years, and I kept a coward's peace about it for far too long. But you should know what you're actually dealing with. She's not cruel for sport. She's a bill that was never paid, and she has spent 4 decades passing it down to whoever was closest. I sat with that, grandmother to mother to me, the same stone, handed forward, and me at the rehab gym, watching a stranger's daughter refuse to receive it from across a parking lot. Understanding where a knife was forged does not mean you hand it your throat, but it does tell you the knife was once a girl. The invitation arrived on proper card stock, because my mother sends her artillery through the postal service. Sunday dinner, the whole family, time we put things right, first invitation in 3 years. Then she called, actually called, her voice warm as something poured slowly from a height. The family wanted to support my little clinic, she said. There was a sum we've discussed, and then she named it. $38,000. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, doing what I do in codes, going very still while everything alarms around me. Not 40,000, not 35, 38. The exact figure in my father's handwriting, in blue ink, in my nightstand drawer. A number I had never once spoken aloud to any of them. The context of my sister's earlier warning, don't bring up that old money thing, suddenly sharpened into focus. They knew Ruth had visited. They had guessed what she'd finally delivered. And this was their response, not an apology, a buyback, not a gift, a repurchase of the ledger at face value, as though no interest had accrued on my entire 20s. My mother kept talking with the smooth efficiency of a closing agent. There would be things to discuss at dinner, of course. The year you'll spend at home with your father, details to work out, and sweetheart, no more digging up ancient history. It only hurts people. Margaret wouldn't have wanted that. There it was, whole and gleaming. Everything I wanted wrapped around everything I'd escaped. I told her I'd come to dinner. The house looked like a holiday. White tablecloth, the good dishes, a roast chicken my father wasn't supposed to eat resting in the center like a centerpiece. My sister and her husband were already seated. The children parked in the den. My father at his end of the table, thinner, collar loose, his eyes doing what they'd done at the water fountain during rehab, arriving at me and immediately leaving. My mother was radiant, I mean that precisely. She had the glow of a woman who has decided to solve something. 3 years of estrangement, a torn aorta, a time-stamped brunch selfie, all of it swept from the surface of that table so completely that for one disorienting moment, I doubted my own memory. That is her genuine gift. She does not deny the past. She simply sets a table where raising it would be considered rude. We ate, my sister's husband talked about insurance. My sister narrated the children. My father said the chicken was good twice. And with the plates cleared and the coffee poured, my mother reached into the sideboard drawer and slid it across the white cloth toward me, face up, the way you'd play a card you'd been holding all night. A check, $38,000. Drawn in her handwriting, signed, dated, entirely real. The memo line read, "Family for the clinic." Graham would be so proud, she said. And then, while my thumb was still on the paper, the terms arrived, warm as the coffee, gentle as a lullaby. The apartment notice given by the first of the month. My old room ready. A year, maybe less, until my father was himself again. And all this old unpleasantness. Her hand made a small circular gesture that encompassed, I understood, the fund, the letter, the phone call. March itself stays in the past where it belongs. For Margaret's sake. $38,000. My dream, printed on their paper. All I had to do was become their daughter again. The one who pays. I did not pick up the check. I did not push it away. I left it on the tablecloth between us and asked my question, the one I had carried in deliberately, the way you carry one precise instrument into a complicated procedure. I kept my voice at the register I use for medication instructions, because it is the tone that cannot be called hysterical. Before I answer, I need to know one thing. If I had died on that table in March, what would you have told the church I was? The room stopped. My sister's husband's cup paused midair. My father looked at his plate as though the pattern had changed. My mother blinked once, the single blink of a system encountering input outside its designed parameters. That's a morbid thing to ask at dinner, she said. I waited. Waiting is a clinical skill. Silence pulls truth the way suction pulls. Fluid. It was my sister who broke. Defensive, reaching for the reflex that had served her at the restaurant 9 months earlier. Oh my God, this is exactly what I mean. She makes everything so. And she stopped. The unfinished sentence sat in her open mouth with its shoes off. She heard it, really heard it. Because the last time she deployed that particular exit strategy, I had been on a table with my chest open, and everyone at this table had known it within the hour. She put her fork down and looked at her plate. Nobody finished her sentence for her. That silence was the most honest thing my family had produced in years. My mother recovered first because she always does. She smoothed the tablecloth with one palm, professional as a funeral director, and smiled. We're looking forward, sweetheart, not back. I reached into my bag and placed Margaret's envelope on the white cloth. Nobody moved to touch it. You all know what this is, I said. Their faces confirmed it. My sister's warning, my mother's exact figure, my father's eyes closing slowly, the expression of a man hearing a verdict he had already internally served. So I'll keep this simple. I slid the check back across the tablecloth, uncashed, face up, until it touched my mother's saucer. I'm not selling, and I'm done being owed. Then I did the thing none of them could have predicted, because it had taken 34 years and one torn artery for me to predict it myself. I took out Margaret's letter and my father's note, the originals, my only copies, the entire archive of what had been done, and laid them beside the check. A gift, not a weapon. Margaret kept this ledger so I wouldn't have to. I'm returning it. As far as I'm concerned, the account is closed. My mother's hand came down flat over the papers, fast, instinctive, securing them, and I watched her understand what that instinct had just confessed. She withdrew her hand. I turned to my father and used the voice I reserve for patience, because it is the kindest register I possess. Dad, you have an appointment with a cardiac specialist in Portland on the 14th, 10 in the morning. I called in the referral Friday. There's a home health nurse scheduled 3 mornings a week for the first month. The paperwork is on the hallway table. You will receive excellent care. I stood and pushed in my chair, because Margaret raised me to push in chairs. You're right about one thing, Mom. Family takes care of family. That's exactly what I'm doing, starting with the family that actually showed up. My mother's voice, when it came, had shed all its warmth and found something old and flinty beneath. If you walk out that door, don't you ever come back. I had my coat half on when I heard it. Not shouted, cracked. My mother's voice fractured down a seam I had never once heard fail in 34 years. And out of the split came the first genuinely true sentence she had said to me in perhaps decades. And who takes care of me? I stopped, my hand on the same doorknob I had turned as a 6-year-old. Behind me, the kitchen clock, my sister not breathing. I understood that I was hearing the engine of my entire family idling in a single question. A 19-year-old girl on a rural road somewhere, spooning broth alone at 2 in the morning, watching her brother's headlights disappear. She was standing in that dining room doorway at 61 years old, still waiting for her turn, so convinced it would never arrive that she had spent 40 years collecting the debt from her daughters instead. I did not turn around. If I had turned around, I would have gone to her, and we would have started the machine again with my grief as fuel. Someone should have, Mom, I said, a long time ago, and I'm sorry no one did. But it was never supposed to be your daughters' entire lives. It's not going to be mine. The storm door swung itself shut behind me, unhurried, measured, as though even the house understood. Monday morning, I signed a 7-year loan against my condominium. My hand, my collateral, my risk. Ruth, who had insisted on accompanying me, slid her own check across the bank officer's desk for a 20% partnership stake before I could object. Margaret would haunt me otherwise, she said, and dared the loan officer to comment. The clinic opened on a Tuesday in April, 13 months after my Jorda attempted to end my life, in a renovated storefront in Bangor with flower boxes beneath the front windows, because the original blueprint had always required them. 22 patients enrolled the first month. Farm wives, retired mill workers, one profoundly stubborn lobster fisherman, people who used to drive 90 minutes for what is now 20 minutes down the road. Maya works 2 evenings a week. Ruth runs the front desk with the organizational discipline of 40 years in postal service. She has alphabetized things I did not know were capable of being alphabetized. On the second Friday, the door chimed and my father walked in, holding high transfer paperwork like a hall pass, having made his own appointment, arranged his own transportation. He filled out the intake forms in the waiting room like everyone else. Where the form asked for an emergency contact, I watched him pause, pen hovering, and then write, Ruth Marrow, sister. He's learning, in his own currency at his own pace. His payment arrives on the first of each month, $500, memo line blank, no accompanying note. I do not keep it. Every dollar goes directly into the scholarship fund we established in Margaret's name for local nursing students. His debt was never mine to collect. It belongs to the generation ahead, which is the only honest direction a debt like that can travel. My mother has never seen the clinic. My sister drives her to church on Sundays. The story circulating in that town casts me as the daughter who hurled money in her sick father's face and walked out. I have corrected no one, not one reply, not one carefully worded response, not one receipts thread. The version of me that existed before March needed to be believed the way lungs require air. I used to think being believed was oxygen. It turns out it was just another invoice, one more debt I was working off for people who were never going to market paid. I let them keep Carol's edition of the story. I know what actually happened. The 2 people who mattered most wrote it down and witnessed it. That was always going to be enough. 10 days after the dinner, Ruth handed me a piece of paper at her kitchen table. I recognized the blue ink before I understood the words. My father's handwriting. No apology, no explanation, no signature line for feelings. Kept the appointment with Dr. Levin, keeping the next one too, FM. The same hand that signed a 12-year-old debt he never repaid, now signing attendance. It was not restitution. It was a man doing one honest repetition at a time, which is the only way hearts or people ever genuinely rebuild. I put the note in the nightstand drawer where the ledger used to live. There is a card in my wallet now, laminated because Ruth laminates things. It reads, in case of emergency, contact Ruth Marrow, aunt, Maya Tor's sister by choice. The woman who once sat in a telemetry bed unable to fill in 2 blank lines, knows both of those lines by heart. That is the entire distance I traveled, if you're measuring it in paperwork, 4 minutes. If you're measuring in permission to finally take up space in your own life, 34 years. Some Sundays, I feel the pull of that empty chair at a white tablecloth. Then a patient walks in frightened, and I pull up a different chair and it passes. My sister turned out to be right about one thing, and I've stopped resenting the sentence for it. I'm not their problem anymore. But I never was a problem. I was collateral, and collateral doesn't get asked how it's feeling, it just gets held against the loan. Not anymore. The ledger sits in a drawer in a house I no longer visit. And some nights, I hope my mother reads Margaret's letter all the way to the final line, because it was never only written for me. Love that keeps a ledger isn't love. Pay what you owe to the people who never kept one, and let the rest of the accounting die with the house that built it. Some families hand you love, some hand you a bill, and sometimes you don't learn which one you've received until you're on a table, and the people who were supposed to come don't. If you've ever had to learn the difference the hard way, tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge, because next week's story cuts even deeper.